Welcome to this week's episode of Awaken Your Soul. I am Lauren Cabaldon.
And I'm Shannon Hibble.
And this week we are going to be talking about relapse and if it's a part of recovery. In the substance abuse treatment world, it's often said that relapse is a part of recovery, or that's a question that comes up a lot of times amongst clinicians, amongst clients. There is actually something called the stages of change, in which oftentimes relapse is part of those stages. From pre-contemplation, meaning not even believing that you have a problem, to contemplation, which is knowing that you have a problem but maybe not being willing to change anything yet. And then moving to action, actually taking action, going to treatment, making a decision. And then oftentimes after that is a stage called maintenance, where you've taken action. You might be sober, or you might be doing something to help your mental health. Again, this isn't just for substance abuse. And then maintenance is continuing the meetings, continuing the therapy, staying engaged in the process. And then oftentimes with substance abuse and even with mental health, there's that last stage that sometimes is put in those stages of change, which is relapse. And I know Shannon and I have different views about this, or we share a lot of similar views about this, but different views to a lot of how the treatment world might see it. It's often said that statistically about 40 to 60% of individuals in substance abuse treatment relapse within the first year. And I know Hazelden recently had a statistic that about 18% of clients in the first 30 days are able to stay sober after 30 days. So that's less than 1/5. And so a lot of, I know clients and families ask, is treatment effective? Is there a better way? But I also want to take a look at, how do we define relapse in and of itself? Is it one day of having one drink, or is it 1 year of relapse? For mental health, it's also more of a gray area. If I relapse in my depression, and I like to kind of take away the stigma of what relapse is and maybe kind of the definition of it, because a lot of times a lot of shame comes with the idea of relapse. And I think opening up a conversation about it, I share with clients, we're always just planting seeds. So even if you've had to go to treatment 5, 6, 7, 8, 20 times, every single time I think you're learning something more, and it's not a failure to relapse. Oftentimes relapse is the psyche's way of going, okay, I've learned a little bit, but can I still have one drink and do this thing and stay sober after that, or something like that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up mental health, because, when you think of, I want to also talk about success, because if you're talking about relapse, and we're basing our statistics off of, whether or not someone relapses after they leave treatment is dependent on whether or not the treatment did well or was successful, right? If that's how we're actually gauging that, then that's, I want to talk about what it even means to be successful after a treatment episode. Right. And so, I believe success doesn't necessarily mean that you just stay sober afterwards. That is part of it. That's our hope, is that someone is able to stay sober. However, it's almost impossible to just stop a behavior and just cold turkey it. Now, there are some people that do it, and that's why it's confusing. And for a lot of people, they can compare themselves and look at someone who did cut cold turkey from something. There are things that are in the unconscious, which is that we're not aware of. So our clients are not aware of these forces that are at play, that are driving them to do things that they wouldn't normally do, like use a substance that can kill them, right? And so not only is it an addictive substance, but there are actually also forces at play that are driving them to use something. For instance, if someone has anger issues, to just say you're never going to go into an anger episode again, that would be setting someone up for failure. And you can actually create even more shame by saying to someone, okay, you've been through treatment, now you're never going to experience anger again. Then they experience anger again, and then they're going to beat themselves up because they think that they have failed, right? So we don't want to set people up for failure. But then the problem is with substances and relapsing, it's scarier, because if you relapse, you can die. Whereas if you're angry with someone, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to die. This is a behavior that if you don't stop, you're going to die. and that creates a lot of fear. And so I think that's really important to talk about is what does that even mean to be successful after treatment?
Some of our most successful clients were some that relapsed and came back and had to do that process of admitting they really are powerless. Sometimes, the psyche is always self-regulating. So sometimes the psyche is going, okay, we finished 2 months of treatment, we got this, and it gets too overconfident. And then it goes, in order for me to just deal with this little anxiety, I'm going to have one little drink. And so instead of that opening the floodgates, a lot of times I try to, teach my clients, okay, push the pause button, forgive yourself. It happened, and it's probably likely statistically going to happen. So I'm even preparing them. There's a high likelihood you're going to relapse in some form. Whether we're working with anxiety, maybe you relapse with PTSD or with an eating disorder, or with your, depression. And how do we kind of reframe that as part of the growth? Maybe this time when you did it, you called your sponsor immediately, or you called your therapist immediately for a session, whereas before you let it go on for, a whole year. So the best thing we can do is, just like in behaviorism, is give a lot of positive reinforcement. Relapse should not be a scary, bad word associated with failure. It should be almost associated with growth. Obviously, we're not encouraging it, but we're, helping clients understand this is their own little path. And the brain does all these things to get us back to something familiar. Almost like if you were in an abusive relationship, and your brain actually might rationalize or justify being back with this person because at least it was familiar, or at least there was an illusion of safety because you could predict their behavior. Same thing with using, right? Maybe my bottle of vodka was the most calming, consistent thing to me, and it was the best thing in my life compared to my wife and my kids and my, job and my boss that's stressing me out. So it's really understanding the dynamic of that person's relationship to their neuroses.
When we talk about going back to something that's familiar, that's including with depression. Studies show that people are addicted to being depressed because that's what they are. They know it's familiar. They're scared of the unknown. They don't know how to be happy. They can't even imagine it. They just know how to be sad, and they know how to be the best sad person.
And they're good at it.
They're good at it. They're good at being sad. And just like someone who uses substances, they're really good at being addicted to a substance. And so, and you can also be addicted to shame. You think that you need the shame in order to stop what you're doing because you've learned that if I just say that that's bad, maybe I'll stop. But actually by doing that, it actually entices you to do it more. You actually feel, when you feel shame, it makes you want to go do the behaviors that you were trying to stop doing. And so it's so important to take the shame and the stigma out of relapse, because I've seen it happen so many times that people feel so much shame around their relapse. They go out way harder, way longer, way deeper. And so if we can train them how to look at relapse in a way that's not stigmatizing or shaming, then maybe they won't take themselves out so much. Maybe, like Lauren said, they call their sponsor, or they get into treatment right away the next day. And we see that happening.
So to answer that question, is relapse part of recovery? Is it a necessary part of recovery? My own perspective is that it might be. Everybody's on their different journey. And I think that if going back to, psychoanalyst Carl Jung's way of seeing, what's called the recapitulation effect, doing the same thing over and over again, also called insanity, trying to figure out how to get a different result, right? I'm going to keep using heroin because I love the feeling of it and where it takes me and the numbness. But I'm going to try to use it and have a functional life. And if I can figure out how to have both, then I've found the answer. And that's the illusion, is that the psyche's trying to stay in that cycle, but then also have something different. And we can't really change anything unless we change something, right? And so with relapse, what I'm looking at is, how did it happen? What did you do different this time? Was your response different to it? Were you beating yourself up more? Did you forgive yourself this time? The response to it is everything. It's not what's going to happen. There's a high likelihood it will happen. And a lot of it we call the mental prelapse. A lot of clients tell me, I had no idea what I was doing. I'm sure you've heard this, until I actually had, a bottle in my hand. I had no idea, remembering going to the liquor store, walking there, paying the store owner, and then walking out of there and drinking. And then all of a sudden I was here drunk. And a lot of times that's the brain's way of bringing us back to something familiar. And a lot of times the brain has now been kind of brainwashed into thinking this thing is safe, at least predictable, familiar, even though it might be destroying our brain and our body inside. It might give us a sense of control or a false illusion of control. So that's, I mean, it's our brain really trying to like have both. It's this paradox, which is an illusion.
Yeah. And to answer the question as well, is relapse part of recovery? I like to say it's not that we want it to be. It just is. The facts just prove it. People are now looking for research to see like how well are you helping these people, and what are the outcomes from your treatment. It's no longer just people coming up with a percentage out of their butts. they're actually coming up with outcomes, right? Yes, maybe it is an indicator that treatment is not perfect.
I can only speak from my perspective here working at ACUA, but I also believe that treatment has played a part in the culture. A lot of treatment facilities in maybe helping clients justify their relapse. That, you know, if a client's coming into treatment, this might be the first time they're going to see a therapist and sharing their truth and their trauma. It's very vulnerable. And if, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about a lot of the fraud and the unethical practices. A lot of what's been happening has been, you know, almost insurance fraud with treatment facilities, luring clients in, encouraging them to relapse, to bill insurance at a higher rate. ACUA has we've been very, very strong and stayed really proud and staying incredibly ethical.
Treatment centers will pay individuals, addicts, to go get other people high so that they can bring those people into their treatment center. That happens.
One thing I'm really proud of working at ACUA and why I've stayed here for so long is that we are relentlessly ethical, because part of the treatment is being honest and transparent. So other industries could probably get away with telling lies to their customers or misleading them. We can't, because the individual is here and they will completely feel if we're being, non-genuine, not authentic. And I think that's important to recognize as our role in potentially, not causing relapse, but creating an environment that can help the psyche justify. The biggest question that I will ask clients is, if they're ready to give up that thought or any barrier to their recovery that has justified or rationalized their using. And a lot of times, deep down, they're not ready to give that up yet. They might say they need to change their life or they can't keep living this way, but they're truly not ready to forgive their father that abused them, or their mother that was an alcoholic that, didn't ever really say I love you to them. Maybe they're not ready. Maybe they want to hold on to that, even though they might be consciously telling us they can't.
And we don't want to shame that either.
No.
Like we've talked about, is we want to give space for wherever that client is at, and it will take the time it needs to take. We are not the ones to determine that. Not even the client can determine that. It will just take however long it is supposed to take. And I know that's such a therapist.
Well, but I will say with that, if you're a loved one that your partner or your sibling or your son or daughter is in the throes of addiction, that doesn't mean you just, let them keep relapsing and you don't have your own boundaries. I want to be really clear. Your boundaries can really help that person change behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't send them love and light and that you don't care and that you don't offer the emotional support. But I do want to say, if someone in your life is continuing to relapse, we don't enable them by, just turning the other cheek and going, oh, that's a part of recovery. That's one kind of word I want to leave you with. If your loved one is relapsing and you don't know what to do, figure out how to establish your own boundaries and make them really clear. And don't set any boundaries you're not prepared to keep, because fluffy boundaries make fluffy results.
Yes. And we have a family program that we talk about that as well, the boundaries and time to practice that, ask questions to the clinicians, including myself.
So thank you everyone for joining this week's episode of Awaken Your Soul with Lauren and Shannon. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the content today.